So the story of whitewashing of Dr. King is going to begin with us with a personal story of what happened in my own son's education at the primary level. And so one day, my son Sikle, who's now a senior, came home on his Tuesday folder, and he had two things in it for us to read for Black History Month. The first one was just a flyer to come to a famous American night on February 23rd. But of course, it was Famous American Night to celebrate white men, which, of course, we did not go because it is Black History Month, and we did feel strongly in my family that Black people get only 1 month to celebrate Black history in schools, and it definitely should have been focused on Black people. The other way the other document that we got from his Tuesday folder was the Scholastic News, and the Scholastic News, which is a wealthy little magazine company used by schools across the nation, gave him this article, this reading in 2010. Okay, so 2 years after Obama was in the White House, this is still how we're teaching Dr. King. All right, so here's an example of whitewashing of King at early levels. Right? Sorry for the bell. First, look at the front page of the story. Do you see how they address Dr. King by his first name? Right? That's the one boldest, and they call him Martin. That is completely disrespectful. We know that we do not do that to white men that are seen as examples of heroes in U.S. history, right? Lincoln, Washington, not George Abraham, right? So there's a problem from the beginning, right? So there we go with his story, Dr. King's story. And it starts with Dr. King gave a speech long ago. He gave a speech that changed the world. Well, here's the problem. One, they have the little person giving the speech as a white lady, not Dr. King. And two, they have the problem of Dr. King as if, everybody just listens when people give speeches, like it's no big deal, right? Like he's just gave a speech and everything is going to change, which did not happen. Remember, 61% of white Americans did not like Dr. King. Even under President Ronald Reagan, Dr. King people did not want to give Dr. King a national holiday, all right? People referred to Dr. King as a communist, and 2 years after giving this speech in 1963, he was assassinated in Memphis. So giving a speech didn't change anything, right? So the problem is when we whitewash Dr. King in this way, we make things out to be better than they were. And that hurts us today, right? That hurts us with understanding modern day issues like removing Confederate statues or retelling history in a way that's true for everybody, right? All right. And when they talk to you about Dr. King's story in this article, they make it out as if Dr. King was just fighting bad laws, and the bad laws were based on water fountains, right? Like it wasn't that bad. Like Black people's lives were not that bad. It was just the laws. Like they just had to drink out a different water fountain, and it wasn't too bad, right? They create these false narratives of what Jim Crow was like. Like they make it look better than what it was, and it wasn't. It was horrific, right? Like Black people couldn't even be a witness against a white person that committed a crime. So there are tons of stories in Jim Crow where Black women were still being sexually assaulted as domestic servants, and they couldn't even bring charges against the person that sexually assaulted them because the guy was white, right? So they make it out to seem as if things were not so bad, right? And they also make it out in this book, which is a classic version of what they do to King. They even do this in high school, right? That once he gave these speeches, everybody just sat around and listened, and white people wanted to hear what he had to say. Totally not true. They also make it as if Dr. King just made up this speech the night before, as if he didn't plan this, as if it wasn't a strategy, as if it wasn't him purposely using television and the media and knowing what he wants to say. The I Have a Dream speech was a speech he had given numerous times before. He didn't think of this the night before. Remember, Dr. King is a genius. He graduated college at the age of 16, at 16. All right. And so there we go again. They talk about as if he just wrote that speech in one night, as if it's no big deal, right? And he got up and he spoke to crowds of people. No, he spoke to millions of people, right? Actually, 200,000 people were there at the March on Washington and heard King speak, which, remember, Washington, D.C. in 1963 was a white-only city. Black people were not allowed to live there, and where Black people were allowed to live was where the government told them they could, and that was created in ghettos or projects, which were done after War II. So Black people weren't allowed to live in the city. Actually, in 1963, when King was coming in and civil rights leaders were coming in to march, white people fled the city because they thought violence was going to break out. So this whole thing about him speaking to people and then people just felt it in their heart and just changed their mood, and now all of a sudden white people are going to like Black people, is just not true. It is a false whitewash narrative. Now, why did Dr. King want to give this speech at the steps of Abraham Lincoln? Because Dr. King's a genius, right? Like, he knew that white people love Abraham Lincoln. And so he wanted to give it from the steps of a leader that white people respected, right? Brilliant move on King's part, right? And so they say that he said, "I have a dream." And of course, people cheered. And of course, what happens is that's the only part in history that people can quote from that day. And this is just not true, right? And then all of a sudden, he gives this speech, and all of a sudden, all of our kids are getting along, and everything is great again. And today, Black people and white people get along so perfectly, right? And thanks, Dr. King. Well, totally not true story. It's a made-up story. Like we talked about, his assassination will happen 2 years from today. King was threatened even by the FBI on a constant basis. He was harassed. Sorry. Right? And this image of racial unity is not true. We hope it can happen, but it's just not true. And you know it's not true because last year, if you would go over to the steps of the cafeteria and you would look over, you would still see people form cliques based on their race. Yeah. Are schools more integrated than they ever were before? Yes. But do we still have racial problems? Yes. Right? So when my son came home with this story, I had to sit him down and tell him that he had to unlearn everything he just learned. Yes. He was like in first or second grade or third grade, I can't remember, maybe first or second, but he did. I taught him the true facts of history at a young age. Why? Because he is a Black man growing up in Orange, and I did not want him to be whitewashed on history, right? So I talked to him about how Dr. King was brilliant, right? And I talked to him about how people did not respect King at his age during his time, but how he continued to fight, how white people didn't respect him, but he continued to fight for human rights. And I also talked to him about Dr. King's personal bodyguards, who were these guys known as the Deacons of Self-Defense. They were actually hired in 1964 to protect King and marchers in Selma, and how it wasn't this story of Black people getting together and singing gospel music and holding hands with white Christians that ended racial oppression. That is actually this fight that is way more in depth than this false narrative that Hollywood and our U.S. history textbooks whitewash, right? So on the left, you see a picture of deacons, right, going to a Klan rally, right? You see that right there. And then there's a little video clip if you want to watch that. But I also want to show you this clip, right? This is an image of Dr. King that people do not see. So just hear this clip real quick for a minute.
Asserting themselves far more than it was competition among leaders themselves. It was a clash of ideas. No question about a clash of ideas.
The leaders began marching at the point where Meredith had been shot.
So this is the march on
Mississippi
Selma.
State troopers forcefully prevented them from marching on the road surface. Carmichael, angered by this rough handling, stepped forward to retaliate, but Dr. King restrained him.
See, this is a year after the I Have a Dream speech.
White folk in the state of Mississippi ain't nothing but a bunch of racists, and the only people who can stop them are the Black folk in Mississippi. Now we've got to make this march our march. This has got to be the march for the Black people in Mississippi. And the only way we can make that our march is that we got to go to every little place and get every Black man and Black woman, Black boy and Black girl out who's not afraid. And let's march. And let's make this our Mississippi. It's got to be our Mississippi.
In sweltering heat, the marchers walked along Highway 51, stopping in towns along the way to register new voters.
How long have you wanted to register? How many years?
Oh, long time.
How many years?
All right.
How long?
I'm 106 years old, 9 months.
Never fool with this thing that you were getting up, not on messing with them now. How do you feel, sir? Me, I feel good.
106 years old, first time registering to vote. Right? Now listen to this chant after the cheers for registering to vote. This is not the image. This is not the image that is in your U.S. history textbooks, right? This is the image of Black people empowering themselves and not begging anybody for the right to vote or for human rights.
20 Mississippi State troopers provided some protection, but halfway through the march, that number was reduced to 4.
And I want you to see this next clip
Governor
of the
Paul
Deacons of
Johnson announced he
Self-Defense.
wasn't, quote, going to wet nurse a bunch of showmen. As James Meredith recovered from his wounds, the threat of another attack against the marchers was an ever-present concern.
There was a new sense of anxiety that we were becoming involved in something that might have consequences, something real. It wasn't an academic exercise.
As the marchers camped each night, they were protected by an organization known as the Deacons for Defense and Justice.
Are any of them armed?
Well, I would think so.
What are they carrying?
Well, it depends. 38, 45, M2.
Are they prepared or trained to use them?
Yes, they are.
So this is not this image that is in your textbooks, right? I mean, you heard Mr. Thomas from the Deacons of Defense, if I could talk, say it directly. What are they carrying? Oh, just some 45, some da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? Like that is to tell people, white bigots, white racists who are threatening King, that they will fight, right? That they have Second Amendment rights and they will use them. You also heard the earlier chant of the gentleman, remixing a famous 60s song to let them know that freedom's got a shotgun, right? Same similar talk that you would have heard during the American Revolution. This is not a story of Dr. King that gets whitewashed as if he just takes things from white people and does not fight back. This is an empowering story that shows you the fight and the demand for human rights that Black people will fight for us in our country, and everybody will benefit from it, including myself, a white woman who benefited from the outcomes of the civil rights movement, like affirmative action. White women are actually the #1 users of affirmative action. And if it wasn't for Black people demanding human rights, then white women, you would not probably have been able to get higher education. Because remember, in the 1970s, UVA just finally let girls into school, right? So it wasn't a thing. So here's a truer version of King. I hope it's a more empowering version. It's not his full story. We'll get into his full story, but it's definitely a more interesting and a more important story to tell than the whitewash version of the I have a dream speech where people could only quote that one line. Thanks for hanging in there on this longer lecture.